Masechet Makkot, Daf Tet Vav. We learned that the general principle is that a lo ta'aseh, a lav in the Torah, if someone violates it, one gets lashes. However, there are some exceptions, and one of the exceptions is lav hanitak la'aseh. When you have a lo ta'aseh, and then that's followed by a misvat aseh that comes after the lo ta'aseh and rectifies the lo ta'aseh in some way. For example, regarding Korban Pesach, Pasuk in Shemot Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Yod says, "Velo totiru mimenu ad boker." You have to eat the Korban Pesach all that night. You cannot leave any over in the morning. That's the law ta'aseh. Do not have any leftovers. But what if you do? Continuation. If there is any leftover in the morning, then you must burn it. Now, in that case, you don't get lashes for having leftovers, and that makes sense because, in a way, the burning of it is the rectification. You don't have to give the person lashes. Listen, you shouldn't have done that. One still violates that sin, but rather than give lashes as the consequence, the consequence is that you have to burn it. So because there's a rectification that comes after the law ta'aseh, therefore one does not get lashes for the law ta'aseh. Instead, just do the aseh and burn it. Good. Based on that, we have a variation case. Amar Rabba bar Hana amar Rabbi Yochanan kol lo ta'aseh shekedamo aseh lokin alav. Rabbi Yochanan says, if it's the other way around, where you have a lo ta'aseh second, and the aseh comes first, you have a misvat aseh first, and then a lo ta'aseh. If one violates that lo ta'aseh, one does get lashes, even though, in this case also, they're somehow related, the aseh and lo ta'aseh. The order makes a difference. Our principle before was if it's a lo ta'aseh and then an aseh that rectifies it, no lashes. But an aseh first and then a lo ta'aseh, you do get lashes. Okay, we're going to see some examples. Amru lo amarta, they said to him, did you really say that? It's not clear who they said that to. Did they ask Rabbi Yochanan or Rabba bar Hana? I think it's easier to say they asked Rabba bar Hana. Did you really say that in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? And he said not. He said no. In other words, someone heard that Rabba bar Hana said the same way Rabbi Yochanan and reported it, and then they said, "Wait, is that true?" And they went to check with Rabba bar Hana, and he said, "Did you say that?" He said, "No." Apparently, he must have changed his mind. Amar Rabba Elohim Amara. But then Rabba, that's a different Rabba than Rabba bar Hana. He said, he swears in Hashem's name. Yes, he said that. He meaning either Rabbi Yochanan, he heard it from Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabba bar Hana. Seems that there's someone's wavering about this. They said it, but then they took it back. And not only that, Rabbah says, he said it, Uchtiba vetanena, and there's a pasuk that proves that this principle of Yochanan is true, and a Mishnah that proves that it's true. Let's see what they are. Ketiba, v'shalechu min ha'machane v'gomer v'lo yitameu et machanehem. The pasuk in the beginning of Sefer Bemidbar says, send out from the camp anyone who is a Metzorah or a Zav. These people are tameh. And so, if someone tameh is in the encampment, you got to send them out. So this is a mitzvat aseh. Then, later on, in that same paragraph, it says, you shall not make the camp impure. Don't make the camp impure. That's a lo ta'aseh, meaning don't allow anybody to come in. Anybody who's tameh that comes into the camp is violating a lo ta'aseh. Now, if this was the other way around in the order, if it says, no one who's tameh may enter the camp, that's a lo ta'aseh. And then it says, and if they did enter, send them out. That would be an aseh. And if it was in that order, you'd call it a lav hanitak la'aseh, and therefore you would not get lashes. However, it's not in that order. It's the other way around. First it says, send out anybody who's tameh. That's the mitzvat aseh. And then the law ta'aseh, do not allow anybody to enter. Do not enter when you're tameh. That's the law ta'aseh. And in this case, one does get lashes. So you see, that's a proof for the position of Rabbi Yochanan that one does get lashes in a case like that. And not only that, do we have a pasuk, Tanena. We also have our Mishnah, Habala Mikdash Tameh. Someone who enters into the Mikdash while Tameh, they get lashes. That was in the list of all the people, Eluhen Halokin. So we see that such a person does get lashes, even though there is a mitzvat aseh to send the person out. So there you go. Now notice that there's actually an important conceptual difference between this case and the case of Korban Pesach. It's not simply technically the order of the words that in Korban Pesach you have a lo ta'aseh and then an aseh. and here you have an aseh first and then the lo ta'aseh. It's more than that. It's also how closely connected the aseh and the lo ta'aseh are. In Korban Pesach, there's a direct causality. There's no way to burn the leftovers if there are no leftovers. You have to violate the lo ta'aseh, leave some left over. It could be on purpose, or maybe you were negligent in it. But if you don't leave any left over, then you won't have anything to burn. So you have to violate the lo ta'aseh first, and then you can fulfill the misvat aseh. Whereas here, there is some independence between them. It is possible that someone enters into the encampment while they're tahor, and then they suddenly become a zav, totally honest, beyond their control, nothing they could do about it, and now misvat aseh kicks in immediately. Oh, you didn't even do anything, you're just sitting there, and all of a sudden something happens and one becomes tameh. Then you have the misvat aseh. So the misvat aseh is somewhat independent, and therefore it makes sense. If that's somewhat independent, then the misvat lo ta'aseh also is somewhat independent. It's not a total rectification of it. You still brought tumah into the encampment. Just don't leave it that way. Make sure to take it out. Whereas Korban Pesach, it is somewhat of a rectification. You have this leftover lying around. What are you going to do with it? You might think, oh, maybe I'll salt it, and I could pickle it and use it as like salami and eat it a week or two later. But you don't want to do that, because then you might have incentive to leave some over because you're full and you want to leave some for later. No, you're supposed to finish the whole thing that night. So in the Korban Pesach, you can only do the aseh by first violating the lo ta'aseh, and it is a rectification because you are getting rid of it after all. Whereas in this case, you can have a case where you first, certainly not on purpose, you didn't bring any tumah into the encampment in the first place when you came in, and it was something totally beyond one's control, and then the misvat aseh will kick in immediately to say, get this person out. So that's why conceptually it makes sense that there should be lashes for violating v'lo yitameu et machanehem, even though there's also an aseh, but the aseh is before it and also not as closely linked to it. Good. So now Rabbah says this is a good rule that Rabbi Yochanan said. Yes, you should get lashes if it's an aseh, and then a lo ta'aseh, and here is a wonderful example. So now we ask, then why did he take it back? Ela mai ta'ama kahadarbe. How come Rabba bar Chana, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, how come when first he said, yes, Rabbi Yochanan said this, and then he said, oh, no, I take it back, he didn't say this. Why was he wishy-washy about it? Mishum de kashya le ones, because he had a problem with the man who rapes a woman. The Tanya, ones shegeresh im Yisrael hu machazir ve'eno lokeh, im kohen hu lokeh ve'eno machazir. The case of ones, let's look at the Pisukim first. Ki imsa ish na'ara betula asher lo orasa utfasa v'shachab ima v'nimsa'u. If a man takes a betula and forces himself upon her, rapes her. So what's the consequence? The punishment is he has to pay the equivalent of a dowry to the father, and he must marry that woman. Right? You caused her not to be a betula. Be difficult for her to get married now. Okay, you love her so much, you want her. Okay, you have to marry her if she wants, of course. She can refuse, but if she's okay with it, he has to marry her. That's number one. And second, lo yuchal shalecha kol yamav, and he may not divorce her all of his days. So here we have misvat aseh to marry her, and then misvat lo ta'aseh, do not divorce her. So you have an aseh and a lo ta'aseh. Now what will happen if he does divorce her? And in violation of this lo ta'aseh, he violated lo ta'aseh. Well, then he has to remarry her, and that's exactly what the Baraita says here. And ones shegiresh, if a rapist, after he did marry her, but then he divorces her, if he's a Yisrael, so then he has to remarry her, and he will not get lashes because he fixed it. He rectified the situation. If, however, he's a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorcee, not even his own divorcee. So now he cannot fix it. So he will get lashes, and he does not take her back. So you see that the lashes is directly dependent on the rectification. And so here we have a case of an aseh first, marry her, and then a lo ta'aseh, and yet if it's a Yisrael and he's able to rectify it, then there's no lashes. This goes against Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says in a case like this of an aseh and then a lo ta'aseh, then one should get lashes. So how come this person doesn't get lashes? Notice, by the way, that conceptually this fits with the model that the misvat aseh does stand alone from the law ta'aseh, because after all, before this happens, they weren't married. So now this guy rapes this girl. Now he has to do something. Even before there's a law ta'aseh, the law ta'aseh is not violated yet. He has an aseh to marry her in the first place. So misvat aseh does stand alone, independent of the law ta'aseh. Then once he does marry her, then he has a law ta'aseh to divorce her. And now if he divorces her, the way to rectify it would be, again, to do the misvat aseh, to marry. But here it's possible also to fulfill the misvat aseh even without violating the law ta'aseh. And that's why conceptually it makes sense that the aseh and the law ta'aseh have some independence, even though they're somewhat related. Anyway, here the Baraita says that the Yisrael does not get lashes, so we ask, Im Yisrael hu machzir ve'eno lokeh amai lo ta'aseh shekedemo asehu ve'likleh. If he's Yisrael, it says that he remarries her and doesn't get lashes. Why not? This is the case exactly of Rabbi Yochanan, where you have a lo ta'aseh later and an aseh first, an aseh and then lo ta'aseh. He should get lashes according to Rabbi Yochanan, and yet this Baraita says he does not. That's our question. Amar Ula. And that's the question. That's why Rabbi Chana retracted and said, no, he didn't say that. I don't know how to reconcile it with ones. So we're going to try to reconcile it. Amar Ula. Lo yomar lo tiyeh leisha beones. Veligmar mimosi shemra. Uma mosi shemra shelo asa ma'aseh. Amar Rachamana velo tiyeh leisha. Ones lo kol sheken. Ula has a brilliant answer. Let me just show you what he's going to do. He wants to take these words, velo tiyeh leisha, and show that they're superfluous in this context of an ones. I could have known that he must marry her from a similar case of mosi shemra that we'll look at in a second. Since these words are superfluous here, it must mean that they should be used in a different context. And the different context would be the end of this pasuk. What he's doing is saying, I don't need these words before the law ta'aseh. I do need it after the law ta'aseh. And by moving it in that way, so then it becomes a law ta'aseh followed by an aseh. That's a lava nitak la'aseh, and that's why there is no lashes. So it's quite brilliant. Let's see the mechanics of it. So let the pasuk not write lo tiyeh leisha regarding a rapist. And I could learn the law that the rapist must marry his victim. We can learn that from Mosi Shemra. Let's see the law of Mosi Shemra. It's earlier in the same Perek. This is talking about a couple that gets married. Good, very nice. They're happily married. The wedding night. After the wedding night, the husband comes the next day and claims, she said she was a betula. We put betula in the ketuvah and paid that amount for it, and put that amount in the ketubah. However, last night there were no betulim. That's his claim. Let's say he's found to be lying. He's lying. She did have betulim, and he's trying to get out of the monetary payment. So he has a punishment. What is the punishment? Number one, he has to pay me'achesef. You give that money to the father. Kiosi shemra al betulat Yisrael. He made a defamation against a betulah in Israel. That's number one. Velo tiyeh leisha. And second, he has to marry her. Now in this case, it's funny because they're already married. So what do you mean, velo tiyeh leisha? It means that he has to remain married to her. So that's the misvat aseh. Velo lo yuchal shalecha kol yamav. And then it says a lo taseh afterwards, and he may not divorce her. So here we have an aseh followed by a lo ta'aseh. So from here we learn that a mosi shemra must marry, or actually remain married to her. And we have a kal vachomer. In the case of mosi shemra, there was no action. He didn't assault her. He didn't do any action against her. He just said words that were false. They were defaming words, but still there were only words. They're a married couple. They had their wedding night, and that was totally legal and consensual. No problem there. The problem is the next day he said she's not a betula. So if where there's no action, there's only words, we say, oh, you have to remain married. So I can learn from a kavachomer, an ones, a rapist, where there is action. He assaulted her, he raped her, all the more so that the punishment should be the same. It is in fact the punishment that you have to marry. Having to marry is also a financial obligation. It means you have to provide for her food, clothing, shelter forever. So this is a significant thing. It's not an ideal way to enter into a relationship, but the point is, it is a consequence. If you're going to, you could think of it kind of like a date rape. He likes her. Okay, you took her. Now you broke her bitulim. Oh, you know what? If she wants to, you have to marry her and you have to take care of her the rest of your life. And so if that punishment would apply to a Mosi Shemra where there's no action, all the more so will apply to a rapist where there is an action. Therefore, the words lo tiyeh leisha in the case of ones are not needed. I could figure it out from a kal vachomer. Lama ne'emar, so why are they there? Im eno inyan lefanav teno inyan le'acharav shim geresh yachzir. If it's not needed for before, put it after. It's not just that we're moving it to the end, but we're applying it to a different case. If I know already that a rapist has to marry her in the first place, so I figured that from a kal vachomer. Then these words, velo tiyeh leisha, I'm going to apply to the case afterwards, after he divorces her. So if the rapist married her, okay, good, he fulfilled that. That I know he has to do from Mosi Shemra. But then he violated lo ta'aseh. It says don't divorce her. He did divorce her. So how do I know that he must then remarry her? From these words, velo tiyeh leisha. So I can move it after. And therefore, this is in fact a lav hanitak laseh, because I'm moving it afterwards, moving it in the order of the pesukim. We're not physically, he's not erasing the pasuk in the Torah, I'm moving it after, but because he's applying it to what happens after he divorces her, so that's the same as a lav hanitak laseh. You can only remarry her if you already divorced her, so it's definitely causally linked, and you couldn't remarry unless you were married first and divorced. And therefore, this turns, Ula is turning these words, lo tiyeh leisha, from a case that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about to a regular lav hanitak laseh. He says that's why in this case it's a lav hanitak laseh, and that's why there are no lashes. And so he resolves the problem. Very good. But now we ask, va'akate ones mimosi shemra lo gamar tika lemifrach ma lemosi shemra sheken lo keum shalem. This kal vachomer that you brought is problematic. You cannot learn ones from Mosi Shemra because we can refute it. Mosi Shemra has a special feature that he gets two punishments. He gets lashes and he has to pay. We saw he has to pay 100 kesef, and he also gets lashes. That's unusual. Generally, sins only get one punishment. Mosi Shemra gets two. Maybe that's why, because it has that extra stringency. So we say there's a stringency that he has to remain married to her. Maybe that does not apply to an ones where there are not two punishments. He does not get malkut. Ela lo yomar lo tiyeh leisha b'mosi shemra. Okay, we're going to try a different way, similar to what Ula said, but from a different direction. In the case of Mosi Shemra, we don't need it to say lo tiyeh leisha, that Mosi Shemra will remain married to her, because ligmar me'ones ma'ones sheno lo kem shalem amar chamana velo tiyeh leisha Mosi Shemra lo kol sheken. If regarding ones where there's only one punishment, he doesn't pay and get lashes, he only pays, and yet the Torah says that the ones has to marry her. Then Mosi Shemra, where there are two punishments, payment and lashes, all the more so he has to remain married to her. So I don't need the words lo tiyeh leisha in Mosi Shemra. Velama ne'emar. So why are those words there? Okay, so you know what? We're going to use the general principle. If it's not relevant to this context, then place it in a different context. And so I could take those words and transfer them, apply them to ones. Now, ones, I already have words that say he has to get married to her in the first place. So since I don't need it for beforehand, put it afterwards to apply it to the case where the ones married her but then divorced her. And so if you did that, if you divorced her, then lo tiyeh leisha, the words from Mosi Shemra, I'm going to put there at the end of that pasuk, and then it becomes a lav hanitak le'aseh for which there is no lashes. And there you go. See, we defended Rabbi Yochanan, and we see how we can explain ones. But then we ask about this too. Wait, you cannot learn a kal vachomer from ones to mosi shem ra, because we can refute it. In ones, he did an action. Maybe that's why he has to marry her. But mosi shem ra did not do an action. So maybe you don't have that mitzvah, because it's not it's only words. Ela lo yomar lo tihye leisha b'mosi shemra share ishtohi. Rather, a different way, another angle, similar idea, but another angle. You don't need the words lo tihye leisha in mosi shemra because they're already married. In fact, those words actually stick out. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's hard to figure out what this means. Let's look at the pasuk again. If you have, this is the mosi shemra, which means they're already married, and then the night after the wedding, he comes and makes a false claim, and says, there was no bitulim. And so, if they find out that he was lying, so he has to pay 100 shekel, and they give it to the father, because he defamed a bitulan Yisrael, velo tiyeh liisha. That means he has to marry her, but they're already married. So these words do not belong here. So what do we do with them? So why are they said? Lama ne'emar imeno inyan mosi shemra teneu inyan leones ve'imeno inyan lefanav teneu inyan le'acharav. So now we're not relying on being a kal vachomer. That's not how we're learning it. So we resolved the problem before of the kal vachomer. We're just saying these words are not needed here because they're already married. So certainly you don't have to say that they have to get married. So since these words are not relevant in this context, apply them to ones. And regarding ones, we already have the words in the pasuk that say he has to marry her in the first place after he rapes her. So I don't need it there. Rather, I need it after the divorce. If you violate the lo ta'aseh and divorce her, then you have to marry her. So therefore, it's a lav hanitak la'aseh, and that's why one does not get lashes, and shalom al Yisrael, everybody's happy. Now we understand Rabbi Yochanan's rule. Ve'ema v'im eno inyan lefanav demosi shemra tenehu inyan la'acharav dideh delalakeh. Hold on. I agree that these words are not necessary here, velo tiyeh leisha, and you're going to move them, fine, because they're not relevant in this context. But before you move them to a different case of ones, why don't you move them to this very case at the end of this pasuk and say, a mosi shemra, he may not divorce her, and then if he divorces her, then lo tiyeh leisha, then he has to remarry her. It's making this law into a lav hanitak la'aseh, and from that we would learn that mosi shemra, who divorces his wife, does not get lashes because he can rectify it by marrying her. So why are you applying it all the way to ones? Rather, apply it right here. And we answer to that, in hachinameh. You're right, that does make a lot of sense. We'll apply it right here. Vate ones vegamar mineh. But once we know it with mosi shemra, so I know that mosi shemra, if you divorce, you have to marry her. Lavanitak la'aseh. And no malkut for that. So I'll learn it from mosi shemra to ones. I could learn the entire law from one to the other, and then they'll still be good, and we defended Rabbi Yochanan. Wait a second. How are you making that transfer from mosi shemra to ones? Are you going to use a kal vachomer? We already rejected that. Are you going to use a mem asinu? Mem asinu is comparing things as a paradigm to similar cases. You don't need a whole kal vachomer. It's just a similar case. Either way, they're not comparable because we will refute it as we did before, that mosi shemra, there's no action. And because the mosi shemra did not do any action, maybe that's why he doesn't get lashes. But you can't assume that would also be true for an ones, where he did an action against her by raping her, so maybe he's worse and he would get lashes. And so we cannot learn this from a kal vachomer or from a me'masinu, and now we are back to square one. So let's try another answer altogether. Ela amarava kol yamav be'amod ve'hachazer vechen ki ata rabin amar Rabbi Yochanan kol yamav be'amod ve'hachazer. Rava says, look at these words here in the case of ones. Look carefully. It does say lo tiyeh leisha. That's a mitzvah taseh. That's talking about initially marrying her After the rape, it comes to court, you have to pay, and you have to marry her. Good, he marries her. Then, lo yuchal shalecha, you may not get divorced. That's a lo ta'aseh. But then there's two more words, kol yamav, his whole life. He may not divorce her his whole life. These words, kol yamav, we can learn from that's a misvat aseh. That's amod v'achazer. You can't divorce her anytime. That means if you do divorce her, so your whole life you have to not divorce her. That means you have to remarry her. So there you go. It is in fact a lav hanitak la'aseh, because the aseh, kol yamav, it's an aseh. That's how he's interpreting it. It comes after the lo ta'aseh, and that's why there are no lashes, and therefore we can defend Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, it works. It works in the case we saw before about Sarua and Zav that have to leave the machaneh. And this case, this is actually, although it has an aseh before, it also has an aseh after, so it is in fact a lav hanitak la'aseh. Amar le Rav Papa le Rava, v'ha la dame lave le lav dechasima. Now Rav Papa asks Rava a general question about Rabbi Yochanan's rule. Rabbi Yochanan said that when you have an aseh first and then a lo ta'aseh, they stand separately and we give lashes to that person. So Rav Papa's question is, wait a second, that structure is not the same as the prohibition against muzzling an ox. We mentioned yesterday that the prohibition to muzzle an ox in Devarim comes right after the main source for Malkut. That's Pasuk Bet in Devarim chapter 25. And then two Pesukim later, Lo Tachsom Shor B'disho. So we mentioned yesterday that the muzzling of the ox is the paradigm for all laws that require malkut. Lo tasum b'disho is a lo ta'aseh that will exclude misvot aseh, and so on. So the Papa's question is, lo tasum b'disho is just a lav. There's only a lav there. There's no aseh before, no aseh after, and we learned before that because there's no aseh after, that's why we exclude lav hanitak la'aseh, does not get malkut, because here it's plain. So therefore, just like lo tasum b'disho has no misvat aseh beforehand, we should say that only lo ta'aseh that has no misvat aseh beforehand gets malkut. But if it has an added misvat aseh before or after, then you should not get malkut because it's not the same as chasima. Amar le mishum tekata berachamana aseh yetera migra gara. Rava counters, that doesn't make sense, because Rachamana, Hashem in the Torah added a misvat aseh, so it should be less stringent. If anything, by adding a misvat aseh related to the lo ta'aseh, that should add extra emphasis. Don't do this. And also an aseh regarding that. So surely you should get lashes. So just because the Torah adds an misvat aseh before shouldn't make it less stringent and no malkut, you should certainly get malkut. Okay, good answer. Yachida Papa, however, says, if so, lav shinitak la'aseh nameh lema mishum techata be'rachamana aseh yetera migra gara. Papa says, I'll ask you the same question about lav anitak la'aseh when you have a lo ta'aseh and then an aseh afterwards, then you should say the same thing. Oh, just because the Torah adds in a misvat aseh afterwards, does that make it less stringent? Say the same thing. If anything, it gives it more emphasis, and one should surely get lashes. But we don't say that. We say lav hanitak la'aseh. There's no lashes because it's not the same as lo tachsom shor b'disho. Amar le'ahu lenatokeh lav hu da'atah. And Rava explains there's a conceptual difference, the one that we mentioned before, which is that when you have a lo ta'aseh and then an aseh, the aseh comes to sever the prohibition. It removes it. You had this meat from a korban pesach, you weren't supposed to leave it over, now you left it over, but you're going to burn it. That rectifies the prohibition. You violated the prohibition, but now by burning it, so you rectify the prohibition, and now you don't deserve lashes anymore. That makes sense if the aseh is after. The aseh comes and fixes the prohibition and severs the prohibition from the punishment of lashes. That works that way. The aseh, in fact, makes it lighter when it's after. But the aseh that comes before and conceptually is more separate, is independent, that would only, if anything, add to a stringency and not undo the prohibition. Good. Now we go back to what we said before regarding these words that says Kol Yamav, and we mentioned Kol Yamav is like a Misvat Aseh that comes afterwards because he can marry her. He has to make sure to the Peshat is Lo Yuchal Shalecha Kol Yamav. He can't divorce her for his entire life. But that also implies that if he does divorce her, then he has any time he should remarry her. Well, when exactly? Tomorrow? Can he wait till next year? At what point will remarrying her undo the prohibition? So it says Kol Yamav. So anytime he can remarry her. So therefore, in a way, he always has the possibility of marrying her and thereby undoing that prohibition. And so that's what Rava said before, that we can read that as a kind of an aseh that comes after the lav. And so that's a lav anitak l'aseh. And that's how Rava defended Rabbi Yochanan to explain why in that case there is no, as long as he's a non-Kohen and he does remarry her, there is no lashes, because it's really like a lav anitak l'aseh. About that we ask, Hanicha leman damar bitelo velo bitelo, ela leman damar kiyemo velo kiyemo, ma'ika lememar. We're about to see a baraita that a certain Tana said to Rabbi Yochanan himself, and in that baraita it says that if there's a mitzvat aseh and a mitzvat lo taseh, like in our cases, then it depends if he fulfills it or not. But there's two versions of that baraita, as we're about to see. One version says, bitelo, if he does something to nullify the possibility of doing the mitzvat aseh. Like in this case of the rapist, if he is a kohen, and so the kohen marries the rape victim, if he divorces her, there is no possibility of him being able to fulfill. So the fulfillment of the mitzvah is nullified, and therefore he gets lashes. But as long as he did not nullify it, as long as, if he's Yisrael, he can marry her. He can marry her tomorrow. He can marry her in 10 years. As long as the possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah is not nullified, he can do the mitzvah and marry her again. He does not get lashes. If you say that, then this reasoning makes sense, that Kol Yamav means he has all of his life to fulfill the mitzvah and undo the lo taseh. Therefore, there's never a time that you're going to give him lashes, because you have this rapist, he married the victim. He divorced her some days later. Now, when are you going to give him lashes? You're going to give him to the next day? He'll say, oh, no, I'm planning on marrying her. I'm going to marry her next week. So we can't give him lashes. So you come next week. No, I'm going to marry her next year. Since at any point he could say, I'm still intending to marry her. So we can't give him lashes at any time, because he can undo the lo taseh at any point in his life. And so therefore it makes sense that we can never give him lashes. So if we have that version, bitelo velo bitelo, then Rava's answer makes sense. There's another version of that baraita that says, if he fulfills it, meaning the court says you have to marry her. If he fulfills it right away, without delay, then he saves himself from lashes. But if he does not fulfill it right away, that's lo kiyemo. Even if there's a possibility he could do it later on, if he doesn't fulfill it within the time period that the court expects, then he gets lashes. But the baraita above said that as long as he marries her at some point, then he does not get lashes. So Rava's explanation of this baraita would not make sense if you say kiyemo velo kiyemo. That's our question. Our answer is midihu ta'ama ela Rabbi Yochanan ha'amar le Rabbi Yochanan letana tene bitelo chayav velo bitelo patur. Rava only gave this explanation in order to help out Rabbi Yochanan, to explain Rabbi Yochanan's rule. And Rabbi Yochanan himself told that Tana that he should read bitelo chayav velo bitelo patur, which is the version that works with Rava's understanding, with Rava's explanation. And so therefore Rava need not explain the other version of Kiyamo, because Rava is only trying to give an answer to Rabbi Yochanan's opinion in the first place, and this is the version of the Braita that Rabbi Yochanan thinks is correct. So therefore Rava is entirely consistent in giving this explanation for Rabbi Yochanan, and it is supported by the Braita according to the version that Rabbi Yochanan himself says. All right. after we already discussed all this, finally we'll actually read that baraita that we've been referencing, the Taneh Tana Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. And one of the professional memorizers recited the following baraita before Rabbi Yochanan. And often, sometimes, when he said it, the rabbi, in this case Rabbi Yochanan, would say, hold on, is that the version? No, there's another version, and might correct, just like if you have a manuscript and there's a mistake, so a competent scholar can say, oh, this is a mistake, and fix it. That Rabbi Yochanan would be able to do that. So too, this is a walking manuscript. And so, here's the version that the Tana says. Kol misvat lo ta'aseh shba, kum aseh. Anytime you have a lo ta'aseh, and there's also a misvat aseh connected with it, that's Rabbi Yochanan's cases, you have an aseh and then a lo ta'aseh, kiyem aseh sheba patur, bitel aseh sheba chayav. If you fulfill the misvat aseh, then you don't get lashes. If you nullify the misvat aseh, then you are liable. So Rabbi Yochanan says, this version doesn't make any sense. Amar le maika amart, kiyem patur, lo kiyem chayav. Bitel chayav, lo bitel patur. This is what, you have to pick a lane. Either you could say, if you fulfill it, meaning you fulfill it in the right time period that the court says, then you're not liable to lashes. But if you do not fulfill it, meaning you're just passive and you let it delay and you don't fulfill it, then you are liable. So that would make sense. That's consistent together. Or you could say, bitel chayav, if you did something or something happened according to which you cannot fulfill it anymore, like if he's a Kohen, or maybe he's Israel, he raped someone, he married that person, he divorced her, and then she married someone else. In that case, he cannot go and marry her again. If something happens because of which he cannot fulfill the misvat aseh anymore, then he is liable to lashes, because he cannot do it. He can't do the misvat aseh. But as long as nothing happened to prevent him from doing the aseh, even if it's a long time, he does not get lashes. So bitel chayav lo bitel patur also gets together. But you can't mix and match. It doesn't make any sense, because if you mix and match, then it means if he fulfills it, means he fulfills it right away, then he doesn't get lashes. But what if he didn't fulfill it, but there is still a possibility for him to do it? So he didn't fulfill it, but he also did not nullify it. That's an in-between. And that in-between would not be addressed by this. In fact, or it would be addressed, but in opposite directions. Since kiyem aseh sheba patur, that means that if lo kiyem, if he just waits on it, he could do it, but he didn't do it in time, then he should be chayav. But from the sefa, it would sound like only bitel. If something happens that he can't fulfill it, then chayav. As long as he can still fulfill it, patur. So this is self-contradictory. So he says it doesn't make sense. You have to read it this way or that way. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan tells him, Teneh bitelo v'lo bitelo. You should read it as the second way. You nullified it or not nullified it. If you nullified it and you can't fulfill the misvat aseh to rectify, then you're going to get lashes. That's why the Kohen gets lashes, the Kohen rapist. But if as long as he did not do anything or nothing happened according to which he cannot fulfill the misvat aseh, then he can keep going and not get lashes. So that's Rabbi Yochanan told him to read it that way, and in accordance with that reading, this kol yamav makes sense, because kol yamav he can fulfill it all of his days. So that's how Rava explained it, and so that makes sense. This would be an aseh that he can do any time as long as he didn't nullify it. So that could be an aseh, and that's why it's like a lav nitak laseh, and that's why in this case there is no lashes. But Rabbi Yochanan says in general, if there's only a misvat aseh before, then he does get lashes. Now in this baraita happens to be Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish omer kiyemo velo kiyemo. Rabbi Shimon disagrees, and there's a different version of the baraita that says kiyemo velo kiyemo. But that's okay, because Rava does not need to explain the baraita according to the Shakish's version, since Rava was only in the first place trying to explain the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Next, the Gemara asks, B'mai kami palge. What is at the root of the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish? Behatrat safek kami palge. Mor sabar hatrat safek shema hatra'a, or mor sabar hatrat safek la shema hatra'a. Rabbi Yochanan thinks that a warning, even though there has some uncertainty in it, is still considered a warning. In order to give anybody punishment in all the whole Torah, there has to be a warning given before he does the prohibition, and that includes for lashes. So before this guy, the rapist, is about to divorce. He married the rape victim, and then he's about to give her a divorce. And so someone will give him a warning and say, don't you know this is a prohibition? And if you give her a divorce, then it goes against the law and you will get lashes. Now, we are not sure if he's going to get lashes because it could be that after he divorces, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 years, maybe in 50 years, he will remarry her. And according to the Biochanan, that's okay. As long as the situation did not change, levatel, such that it's nullified, the possibility of remarrying her is nullified, it remains open. So we don't know if he's going to do it or not. If it then becomes nullified, well, then it will turn out, oh, yep, you violated it. Now, that warning that we give way before, we don't know if he's actually going to deserve lashes or not. It'll depend on what he eventually does. And as long as there is a possibility of him fulfilling it, he won't get lashes. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan says that he will get lashes if indeed it becomes nullified, like if he is a Kohen, or if something happens, makes a vow that I'm not going to marry her, or something like that, or she gets remarried to somebody else. Then if any of those things happen, he will in fact get lashes. How could he get lashes? If the warning was about an unsure situation, that's okay for the Biochanan, because he thinks in general that an uncertain forewarning is still a valid forewarning. Whereas Resh Lakish thinks that an uncertain forewarning is not a valid forewarning. It has to be something that you know that he's going to get this punishment within this certain time if he does not do X, Y, and Z. And therefore, it makes sense that Resh Lakish is consistent with his opinion. He doesn't say batel, but rather kiyem. That way, before he's going to divorce his wife, he says, listen, if you divorce your wife and then you don't marry her before this date, the court says so, then you will get flogging. He will definitely get flogging if he divorces her and then does not marry her within that date. So it's a definite forewarning. Like all forewarning, he can stop before and make sure not to do what he's told not to do. But if he goes through with it, then by a date, then he will get lashes. So that's called a definite forewarning. And so Resh Lakish, it makes sense that Resh Lakish says that an uncertain forewarning is not a forewarning, and that's why Resh Lakish can say batel, because batel, that could go on forever, and we never know what's going to happen with that. The Gemara next is going to say v'azdu l'ta'amaihu, that Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, they have a machloket about this very issue of Hatrat Safek in other cases as well, and we'll leave that on to the next stuff. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.